So it must have been in 2008 that I was visiting Saint-Nazaire, which is a coastal nomadic city in France. And so they asked me to think of a project to do there. And quite instantly I thought that I would realize or produce an exhibition that was related to the very context of Saint-Nazaire, so to its inhabitants, its history or something like that. And then I found out that Saint-Nazaire apparently is the last liberated Nazi Germany enclave in France. So, and they have a super large bunker over there, which is a kind of parking place for 14 submarine boats. And so it's a traumatized little city, and it had to reinvent itself after the Second World War, and so they started to construct cruise liner boats and parts of airplanes. And I thought, well, the cruise liner boat, that might be something interesting to work with, since it says so much about how we live today. So I don't use the cruise liner as a metaphorical image for the nostalgia or the nostalgic, because then I would end up making a Titanic or something. So it's more like how they are conceived and produced today. And today we have cruise liners that look a bit like shopping malls, you know, like everything is tamed and organized and structured for leisure and consumption. And at the same time, it also is quite close to gated communities, you know, like the hyper-rich that live in large, kitschy mansions and, you know, like entirely fenced off and overly protected communities, or, you know, like artificial villages. And they're so over-controlled and over-preconceived that one could argue that there is no life in it anymore, because there's no danger, there's no improvisation, everything is controlled by, you know, Big Brother-like cameras, everything is protected by guards. And so it's a kind of artificial life. And I think today when you travel, you notice that a lot of hotels, for example, look identical. A lot of coastal cities look identical. They have the same kind of tourism to offer. So everything looks like a formula or a concept that is almost replaceable. And even to that extent that you could say or argue that worldwide there is a kind of no man's land which is spreading out and which doesn't really have an identity anymore, but which is safely protected and preconceived and pre-thought. And so the whole project I started to develop was not just about a fictional cruise liner, but about how we live today and how we organize life, how we stage life. My cruise liner is called Sea of Tranquillity. It's a slightly ironical title, because of course it could imply both like a very peaceful environment, but it could also mean that nothing happens on board of my ship. And I label it my ship because it's it's just a fiction. It doesn't exist, but it's something that could exist. It's not fantasy. It's not a Lord of the Rings kind of fantasy with creatures and strange people, but it's something that could actually exist. So when I started to develop my largest cruise liner in the world, I was in touch with boat engineers to find out whether my ship could float or navigate or not. And I worked with an architect to make the design credible. So I thought it really has to be something that could actually exist today. And to me that's very important, because throughout all my work, whether I make paintings or drawings or videos or animation films or sculptures, it's always fictive or fictional, but it always has also something realistic about it that you could accept as something real. It's something that you could compare with, for example, a novel. When you read a novel about fictional characters and situations, but it's written in a way that you take it for granted, that you believe it, that's the kind of fiction I like to produce with my imagery. Like it looks real, or it looks like something that exists or could exist, but it's a fiction. And so in that regard, my work is about staging fiction or creating a kind of parallel worlds that are close to ours, so you can identify yourself with it, but at the same time it doesn't exist. And so many times when I made large installations that people could sit down in, like once I made a motorway diner which overviews a nocturnal highway, and when people sat down in it, they said like, I know this place. While it was not based on an existing one, but it was like an evocation of something that we knew or know and that we are familiar with. And so I thought, how can I conceive the exhibition, how can I produce an exhibition which is about a fictive or fictional cruise liner? And then I thought about how we make stories. It's, if you want to make a story about something mythical or something important, you create a museum about it. And most museums are produced in a way that the average 11-year-old can understand it. So it's simplified and it's narrowed down, and it's a kind of cruel reduction of what actually took place. So we are storytellers as human beings, and we try to tame everything into an understandable little story. And so I thought, okay, I make a museum, but it's quite dark in the museum, so it's as if you enter the museum after hours, when people are still arranging or installing the museum. And I put all kinds of objects in there that all tell a story about this mythical cruise liner. And I'm putting mythical between brackets because, of course, I remember like one time my assistant Kurt and I were in Singapore, and of all places, and we went to a shopping mall to see the largest fountain in the world. And it was in the heart of a shopping mall, and it was an incredibly ugly fountain. And when we arrived there, it was even not working. So it was like a very sad monster of a still life of the largest fountain in the world. And so nowadays we like to create myths. You know, we like to make something fantastic. You know, so there's an ongoing competition between a lot of cities to have the highest building in the world, which is, of course, also very ridiculous. Currently, it's in Dubai, and it's the highest building in the world, but that's all you can say about it because it's not even a nice building. So, and that's the kind of way we use all kinds of categories that we give value to or importance to. And so this museum gives importance to my non-existent largest cruise liner to date. So I thought, if I make one, it has to be the largest to date. So I have to take the same boat as all those people that invent these false categories and try to say something about it. It's like close to where I live, there's the largest shopping mall in the area. But of course, it's again another shopping mall. So. It's like both in the sculptures and in the film about my boat. I try not to tell a very specific story, but it's true that I aim or try to evoke a mood. And that's something I always do, try to evoke a kind of overall mood. And I think it's both melancholic and beautiful. So I'm trying to find, well, I can only try to make something that to my own standards is beautiful. Someone else will go like, this is ugly, you know. So, but I try to use beauty as a kind of mediator to talk about a subject and to create a mood. And I think, you know, it's like, for example, when you read a novel, you don't want to read a novel where everyone's happy and everything's fine. You know, it's just a boring novel then. So I like the idea that to work with the tragic and the melancholic because it's consoling for the spectator. It's like when I've seen a tragic movie at the cinema, I always leave the cinema with a kind of relief, with a feeling of a consolation of, like as if you can deal better with tougher things afterwards. So it's, I think if you would use beauty or something beautiful or precious or really beautifully handcrafted or painted and just, you know, subject-wise work with very, let's say, nice and soft contents, I don't think it's going to evoke so much, or it's going to stick to your mind. So I like the notion of the tragic, but also, I also like humor. And I think in the film there's also some humorous moments between people that cannot have a decent conversation with each other, or there's something like, it's not only weeping and it's not only dark and melancholic, it's also funny and light in a way. And this is what I'm aiming for, to try to find a balance between something dark and mysterious and hard to point down, and on the other hand also something light and humorous. Although I must admit that not too many people find the humorous side in my work, but I think it's there, but it's something maybe quite between the lines of everything. Well, I studied painting, and I think everything now more or less refers to painting and cinema in a certain way, although I use different media. It's just like my twin brother and I, because I have a twin brother, when we were teenagers, we were always drawing comic books, and we were really into comic books and making comic books and drawings, and so somehow my parents always presumed that we would go to art academy and become an artist. And now my brother is a graphic designer and a teacher, but it all comes from there. So I like the pictorial, and I like detailing a lot. And apparently when we were at elementary school and high school, both my brother and I had the talent to very fastly learn how to do something, like to sculpt a head realistically, or to make a portrait, or somehow we were very clumsy in sports, so we couldn't play football or anything of that kind, so we were really bad in many things. I was bad in science and mathematics, and the only things I was gifted for was language, because I was good in writing and in drawing, and and handcrafting things, and so it's a passion, and it's an interest, and it's something where everything comes from, because I think when you're an artist, first of all, you have to enjoy to produce something, to make something that didn't exist before, to create something. So there has to be a kind of fundamental need to create things. And for me, it's not so important what that actually is, what that really is. A painting or a sculpture, it doesn't matter so much. The medium doesn't matter so much. And this is why I don't want to talk too much about the medium itself. I don't want to make a film which talks about filmmaking, or I don't want to make a sculpture that talks about sculpture in the first place. Of course it does in the second place, but in the first place I want to convey or construct or evoke a mood and talk about a certain content. And then of course afterwards it's also a sculpture. It's always a kind of statement about sculpture as well, that's inherent to the very object. But it's like the black and white watercolors here, they're kind of cinematic because they're mostly in this direction. And so I'm not making a statement about black and white watercolor paint, or about the history of painting, but rather I try to evoke places, that you can mentally wander around in as a spectator, rather than make a statement about the medium itself, which is a more, let's say, modernist attitude. We have had sculptors and painters making statement about the act of painting or the act of sculpting. There was this, for example, this sculptor called Rukrim who had large pieces of stone, and he just split the stone in two, and so that was the very act of sculpting, just like hammer and split the stone. And so this is a sculpture that talks a lot about sculpting, and I think that's a valuable discourse, but it's not mine. I'm more an artist from the postmodern era, and I like to sometimes use kitsch aesthetics, sometimes minimalist aesthetics, sometimes a lot of colors, at times no colors, and also a whole range of media, because there are tools that you can use. And in that regard, I think I'm much more a postmodern artist than a modern artist. Yeah, it's, I had this, when I was studying art, I had discussions about emotions, because I had some die-hard modernist teachers. At first they were judging quite cruelly on my way of drawing, because I drew with a lot of details, as you still can see in the watercolors. And they said, no, you have to reduce everything into one line, you know, or one color, a monochrome painting, or a line, or this or that, or one gesture. And I said, I do my best, but I can't, you know, it's against my nature. And then also when we talked about the contents of work, I said, I'm not the artist to make statements about a medium. I don't want to make a video that is about how to use a camera, but I want to evoke something. And it can be emotional as well. And to me, that's quite important. For example, one time I made an entirely white work, which is called Location 6. It's an endless snow landscape. And you can sit down in the middle of it, and then you're surrounded by a sculpture of 300 square meters. And it's like absorbing you in the fog, and it's white trees and snow. And I got reactions from people that said, we stayed in such a long time, and I came back 3 times, and it moved me, and then I'm, you know, like the happiest man on earth, that it can really speak to the emotions. But there's a lot of confusion between emotions and sentimentality. Sentiments or sentimentality is like the kitsch version of the emotion, you know, it's like an American weekend film on television, you know, that is too, let's say, too cheesy to be true, you know, like when it's over the top emotion I don't like, but I do like emotion.